This lesson addresses the issue of whether boards should have policy manuals. And the short answer is yes, but in our view, a board policy matter is not exactly what most advisors to management consulting industry have in mind. We have seen guidance for charities indicating that a board should have a policy manual in place that put forth all the policies of the organization. That seems a little heavy-handed. There's no reason why the policies of an organization should be described as the board's policy manual, even though in the modern age, when a lot of laws require that there be written policies for an organization, putting them together in one resource can be useful, but it probably is a better description to call it something like employee handbook or employee policies. The thought that it's called a board policy manual really adds nothing to the weight of it. And if you've got a policy within an organization on whether, for example, an employee is permitted to ever drive a company car if they've ever been convicted of a DUI, you want that individual or his or her supervisor to know the answer. And a logical place to find that would be in an employee handbook, not in something that appears by its title being directed towards the directors on the board. So it's not where you think it ought to be that matters, but to make sure that it's clear what exactly the policies of the organization are. However, having said that, there is a document that we believe most organizations should have, and it's hard for me to come up with a better name for it than Board Policy Manual. And what we recommend is that you have a document. For most organizations, it's not going to be even 5 pages long, that has in it, copied over from the minutes, any resolution passed by the board that cannot necessarily be fulfilled within 3 years. The reason we pick 3 years is since that's the average lengthy term for a director to have, it's entirely possible for a board over the course of 3 years to have a complete turnover of directors so that nobody on the board now has a recollection of policies that were adopted more than 3 years ago. So our recommendation is if something has been decided by the board that could still be binding after 3 years have passed, that it should be in a resource that indicates to the board what they decided before. They don't have to continue it if they don't like it. They just passed a resolution reversing it. But this does have the advantage of keeping employees following instructions given by the board, though long ago, that have not changed and thus are still binding on the employees. It's also a tremendously useful tool for new directors getting onboarded, that they can look at that and see where do things stand right now. They can capture the essence of what's been approved in the last 3 years by reviewing the minutes for the last 3 years, something that we enthusiastically endorse. But it's asking a lot, particularly for an organization that may be over 100 years old, to tell new directors you ought to read every single set of minutes going back to the beginning of the 20th century. But there are resolutions that could have been passed back then that have never been reversed. They are binding on the staff, even though nobody may be aware of it. The example that comes to mind is that you could have a donor come to you after the donation and in a conversation with a director says, "Can you do me a favor? I know my sister has given money to you just as I have, and I can't stand her. And nothing would bug me more than the thought that this organization, for which I've given a lot of money, would at some point name a building or a program after her. So could you, as a board, just make a decision that you're never going to do that?" So the director goes to the board, presents the resolution, and it passes. Now, I've carefully chosen the facts to make it clear this is not a restricted gift. It is just a resolution that a donor asked for with no consideration, and the board approved. That resolution is binding in perpetuity unless the board changes its mind. So 50 years down the road, if staff were to name a building or a room in the building after that unpleasant sister, they're actually violating a board policy. Now, maybe that policy was set before anybody in the organization was born, but it still is a board decision and has not lost its effectiveness by the passage of time. There may not be anybody who really cares anymore, but a board resolution is binding on the staff. There's no easy way to learn that because nobody will go through and review all the minutes of an organization just because they want to be attentive. So put that in a document that I think is easily described as the board policy manual that indicates those things that cannot necessarily be completed within 3 years. Now, that can be reversed anytime. It's not binding on the board in perpetuity. The board can say, we just don't like this policy. We actually like that sister. We changed our mind. And 30 years after the resolution was passed, they passed a motion changing it. And so also the people who have control over that document, they can remove things that no longer have any relevance. For example, we have actually known of situations where this happened, where a visitor to a school campus rescued and saved the life of somebody in the cafeteria who was choking. And the school was so pleased that they told the individual that anytime he is in the cafeteria, he is welcome to have a free cup of coffee on the school's generous benevolence. And a volunteer actually did that. And every week or two would come by and have a cup of coffee, and they would throw in a bagel as well and not charge him for it. Well, if that was a resolution by the board, and it is then binding on the staff that they cannot charge that person. However, if 20 years later that person dies, that's really not a relevant resolution anymore. And it can be removed from the handbook, not because the resolution has been reversed, but it simply has no relevance. Its usefulness is gone. It doesn't need to be there anymore. But every organization would benefit from having this kind of holding on to legacy that is easily addressed by having those resolutions that have been approved by the board put in a document where they can be examined if it takes more time than the span of board members' terms for it to be carried out. And that is a good board policy manual. Other than that, the policies that the board may approve for the organization can be put in something that's just as easily called an employee handbook.